I'm Liz Sumner, and this is I Always Wanted To, the podcast where I interview people who are doing things that others long to do. What have you always wanted to try? This is part 2 of my conversation with Manny Faces of the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy. But before we get to the interview, I just want to give a quick welcome to our new listeners and followers. I'm really glad you're here. And I have a couple of requests to ask. First, if you like what you hear, please share it with your friends and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you would. Also, I'd really like to know who's listening. So if you could fill out a brief survey, you can find it at lizsumner.com/survey. And if you're really a fan, you can support the podcast at patreon.com/alwayswanted. Thanks so much for listening. Here's the interview. You're making it sound very fascinating, but I have some misunderstandings, some biases I want to ask you about.
Please.
So one thought is that there's a lot of music that is not pro-woman.
Yes.
How is that still the case?
Sure. There's still some of that in hip hop, just as there is that in country music, and just as there is in that murderous style of music called opera. So yes, that's an issue. I think. Look, and this is not to say that these things don't exist in hip hop music and culture. Hip hop culture is weird because it's sort of an amalgamation of a bunch of different cultures, right? So, of course, primarily from Black and brown communities, African American, Hispanic Americans that created hip hop and get all the credit, and nothing should be taken away from that. But also those communities come in with certain, their own cultural things. And, the church in general, it has been misogynistic, has been patriarchal, has been, and I'm not saying the black church, I'm saying the church, all churches, to be honest, like most of them. So if your art is a reflection of life, then a lot of those things are going to trickle in. And again, because rap music has always been sort of, for young people, young African American, Hispanic people, even poor people. Look at Eminem, poor white people in America. It's because of its lucrative nature, the stars, the ability to become a star. The low barrier to entry. To be honest, it's what made hip hop so great. Is that you didn't need all the musical instruments. You just needed your voice. You just needed to be a rapper, or you just needed a turntable. You didn't need a radio station worth of equipment. That made it very aspirational for a lot of people. So if a artist would be very successful and just so happen to be spewing misogynistic lyrics, violence-filled lyrics, I'm a drug dealer, I'm a gangster, I'm a killer, I'll smack this woman. You're now looking at that person as a role model, not for life necessarily, hopefully, because I think your life circumstances will dictate more what you do than a song or two on the radio. But as an artist, as an aspiring artist, someone who's looking to get out of the hood, someone who's looking to get out of their, bad financial or, bad societal situation that they've been placed in through systemic racism and all the things, but nonetheless, and rap is a way out, just like basketball and sports. And, it was always pitched as this way out of the ghetto, way out of the hood, all these, very narrow-minded, but effective messages. Because you'll see millionaires that are playing basketball. You'll see millionaires that are rap artists. And if the rap artist is a millionaire, you can't play basketball like the NBA player. You can't play football like the NFL player, but you can rap. So maybe I have to mirror what I'm hearing, because that's who gets the record deals. And for a good time, that was facilitated by the record labels. This guy sells and he's talking all this junk, then let's just get more folks that are selling and talking all this junk. And when it comes to women, let me get the most, provocative, sex-oriented woman, because that's what worked before. But artist friend of mine, Homeboy Sandman, reminds people, Outcasts albums, I think, and forget Eminem because that's problematic too. But Outkast is one of the greatest selling groups of all time, and they weren't that. So it's not that it doesn't sell. The question is, why do the the people with the purse strings
Mm-hmm.
decide that this is the way to go? And when you do that, I think you negatively influence young people in a number of ways. And I do think it spills into their lifestyle. And I think that's, obviously we don't ignore that. And we think it's one sided, which is why we advocate for all these other things. Like, yes, of course, if the only TV show you ever watched was Cops, I don't know if you guys have Cops, you would think that every black person's a criminal, every poor white guy's on meth, and that's your exposure to it. You wouldn't know anything else about anything. Mm-hmm. So it does come to exposure. Young kids before the last few years, if that's what's on the radio and that's how they're told, your culture is telling you to be, then that's what you're going to parrot and mimic and in some ways, model your lifestyle after. But I would argue that large but not exclusive tip of the iceberg is hiding what hip hop culture really does, what really can give you, which again, when used in the right way, can do all of the things that counter the things you're talking about. So yes, there's music that is, derogatory towards women. Do you know how much music celebrates women? Do you know how much music people are making music that celebrate black women who obviously are, at the brunt of some of the negative, music? Do you know how Kendrick Lamar album won a Pulitzer Prize? So yes, that exists, and yes, no one's really happy about it. The other thing that someone points out, I think Dr. Bettina Love, who's a hip hop based educator, and writes about abolitionist teaching, trying to, change the school districts from teaching, sort of in a white supremacist kind of way, says some of that negativity is actually, you can actually gain information from that. So there's two things. Someone says it's sort of a memeified idea that in our days we would rap about selling drugs. Now kids rap about taking drugs. Which some of the, I see that. There's a whole kind of subgenre of hip hop and rap that's sort of, influenced by, taking Xanax and all these kind of terrible things that are affecting society. But what that should tell you, just like the drug dealing raps told you before, that there was this entire ecosystem of a drug dealing economy and crack epidemic was rifling and destroying these communities. Like did you get the message that these guys are criminals from that? Or did you get the message that these guys have absolutely no options, are finding any way they can, including having to poison their own communities because otherwise they'll get killed? There's depth to what you're hearing as well. And if young people are making songs about taking drugs and being depressed, and young people are listening and, as you say, relating to songs about taking drugs and being depressed, if you don't recognize that means that young people of a certain age and a certain cultural, affiliation are having horrible mental health problems that need to be addressed, or you could say, oh, this is just drug rap. These kids are crazy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's decide. So yes, there are negative, for lack of a better term, influences or negative imagery or messaging in rap. But really, the problem is not that they exist, because I'm not a censorship guy. If you want to talk junk, talk your junk. The problem is the lack of perceived balance. And for every song that has one of those messages, I could find you one, if not more, that don't. They're just not on the radio. And the goods, again, quality, all that, it's subjective, I understand. Mm-hmm. But they're not on the radio. They're not being perceived. And this conversation that we're having, anyone might listen to this, is like, I never even heard about hip hop being used to improve children in school. That's the problem. Not that the songs exist, not that negative imagery and messaging exists. Because again, country music, opera, church, families, regular life, We all have these biases and these, and again, the way outsiders look at rap: negative, horrible talk, negative, drugs, violence, women, sex. Yeah, absolutely. But we would be remiss if we just like looked at blockbuster films and ignored documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? These
Mm-hmm.
super glorified, big budget productions without
Mm-hmm.
looking at like real life and the rest of the film spectrum and indie
Mm-hmm.
films and,
Mm-hmm.
and comedies so I look at rap the same way.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have definitely convinced me on the cultural side, but melodically, now I'm an old fart, and I grew up with the Great American Songbook, and I'm a singer, and I love that stuff, and I don't hear melodies.
Right.
So help me get over that in order to appreciate hip hop.
Absolutely. I've been having this conversation I had this conversation with my dad 20 years ago. And there are I've interviewed a couple of music folk that are so good at the inner working. Like if you're a music person, they will explain it all a lot better than I could with all the technicalities. But I'll give you a few anecdotal ways I look at it. First of all, you probably haven't heard enough rap.
I'm sure that's true.
So, and that's fine. And that's, respectful. A lot of rap was built off of samples, which were sampling and looping music from the past, from the 70s, 60s, from different genres, but primarily the soul, a lot of jazz stuff has been looped and brought in. A lot of producers would very, in a savvy way, stack different samples on top of each other, perhaps from different songs, from different genres, from different artists, from different times. If a song had a melody when it was originally created, and then we sample that song and we use that loop as the basis of a new song, there's still a melody there. It didn't go away. Okay.
So then the melody is done by the instruments, which is the samples, but the rapper, the voice doesn't carry the melody in any way.
Well, both. So,
Oh, okay.
So I think some. And again, this actually goes into like some of the changes over the years, and we talk about a little bit more modern way of doing rap music. There's a little bit more sing-songy nature. There's different flows and different cadences, and some of that does kind of mirror. Again, we talked about Rakim, who maybe rapped over rather simplistic loops. If they weren't orchestras. But they were simplistic loops that were taken from, maybe a 70s soul sample or something like that. But the nuance in how he would rap was melodic. Again, mirrored after jazz and improvisation. Now, his tone may not change. Again, the technicalities of it. But let me go on to say, not only do we have samples that were sampling actual music, it's not like so some folks, my dad used to have this argument because he would know the very early, raps, which were very drum heavy and synth sounds and nothing else. But again, as you go forward through the years, the sampling, the bringing in of different genres, jazz, soul samples, rock and roll, all these things that were sampled and brought in, and then you'd build off of those things. However, then you move on to groups that are actually playing original music. And again, some of this doesn't make it to the radio. This is not always, a front and center thing. But if you look at artists like, Anderson .Paak, who's sort of a blend of, I guess you'd say R&B and rap, but also brings in rappers a lot. The Roots has been doing rap for how many years? They're a full band. They're on the Tonight Show. There's no denying their musicality I gotta say that the Roots are probably one of the top, 10 bands ever, not just hip hop bands, but again, like Hamilton, hip hop bands don't start and stop with the Roots. There are tons of artists, phony people. There's a lot of artists that are rap, they're hip hop, full bands, original music. The band called Fuse, independent, not superstars, not on the radio. Again, what you hear or what you're kind of exposed to tends to be formulaic, tends to be structured in a certain way that works earworms. What you hear on the radio, there might be more melodious sounds in radio rap these days. I think there's a genre blending that's happening with sort of traditional R&B sounds, modern R&B sounds with hip hop, so it's not so hard and rugged and gritty anymore. So even if you turned on like today's music, you might find some of that. But these are all sub factions. So, you know, would I be able to look at another genre of music and make that same comparison? And say, well, polka isn't. No, I mean, there's melody, there's melody in all forms of music, and musically, that also may not. I wish I got to study these folks. They make the argument so much better than I. But also, melody is not our strong suit. That's fine. We may not have as much melody. We do, but let's say we didn't. We have more words. We have more concepts. We have way more, analysis of life and, and inspirational, aspirational, motivational than any other genre. So yeah, maybe, but I'd argue no. But even if that wasn't our strongest suit, because a lot of the artists are electronic based, loop based, formulaic, made for the radio. I named a few. I'll give you 120 more in an hour that are, bands or musical or producers that make, kind of music from scratch, and a bunch of artists and producers that have used sampling to in an intricate way that there's melody all through it. It's sampling other people's music in which melody existed. So I think that's a valid concern up until you kind of just get exposed a little bit more. And I think most people would say, and again, hip hop as music is being taught in the Berklee School of Music in Boston, is being deciphered. Ethan Hine is a brilliant musicologist that can break down musically with turning songs into sheet music and breaking down all the things, and does it with rap all the time. So trust me on this one.
I do, and I want you to educate me. So
Yes.
Help me. How should I begin? Who should I listen to first?
It's all very subjective. What I think
Sure.
is good isn't necessarily what you might think is good. But this is what I did to my dad when I had this conversation with him years ago, and I wish he was around today. We'd be having these debates every day. And matter of fact, a lot of the work I do is speaking to him. He passed a few years ago, and a distinguished professor of sociology. Smart guy, musical background, and I began. Again, this harkens back to these discussions I had with him a long time ago. So, kind of everything I do is trying to still educate him. So this comes easy to me. It depends on what you like, in a way. So I knew he was a jazz guy. Guru, who was an artist from a group called Gangstar. Gangstar was a very successful duo of sorts, a DJ producer and an MC. Came up, in that 80s, 90s era. And he went on to produce a series called Jazzmatazz, where most of the records, if not all, of the singles and the songs were directly sampled from jazz. And he was a kind of artist that wasn't very complex, some would actually say monotone in his delivery. So he was relatively easy listening. You didn't have to decipher his words so much. A relative newcomer, relative newcomer, he's been doing stuff for a bunch of years. This guy named Sky Zoo from Brooklyn often incorporates jazz into his work, but he is a much more intricate lyricist. And every line he'll say sort of has a hidden meaning, or a meaning only known to him. Like not thorough, he's not so cryptic, but he'll make a lot of cultural references, a lot of things that the casual listener wouldn't know what the hell he's talking about. I don't know what he's talking. He's talking about the strings on his JanSport. What's that? Well, JanSport backpacks were a big staple in the in the communities, and there were strings you put your thumbs in, you put So there are all these references. It's always like weird, that if you're not from Brooklyn, that grew up in the 80s and 90s, you might have no. But it's also, if you listen to him break down his lyrics, 'cause he does these little sessions where he'll say, okay, here's what I was trying to say. Here's what I was saying. And he breaks it all down. Then there's this is poetry. I don't understand Edgar Allan Poe when I first read it, but if someone teaches me it's the same thing. It's literally the same thing. So maybe you like cryptic, needing to decipher lyrics and jazz. Or maybe you just want to kind of listen to, jazz influenced hip hop, but without, your brain melting from trying to figure out what the guy is saying. I might point you in those two different directions. Full bands, again, just listen to the Roots catalog, go back to the early Roots, Do You Want More is a great place to start. Was that the name of the album? I'm checking because it's important, because it's a great starting point album. It was for me anyway. Do You Want More? The album was Do You Want More? The Roots, 1995. This sort of seminal album from the group. Obviously, they've done so many things in the past years that you can then follow up with. Again, that's a full band, brilliant lyricism. Black Thought, the guy, Tariq Trotter, who's on the Tonight Show with is a brilliant lyricist. Probably one of the better, certainly one of the better, probably one of the best lyrics against Subjective. We have that top 5, talk all the time. But brilliant. And if you listen to the early work, it's a nice entree. If you listen to the later work, it's riddled with social justice themes and a much better. He's older now. He's a grown man. He can now analyze life a little bit better and talk about the trials and tribulations of growing up, or his communities. So the Roots is brilliant, and it's as musical as it gets. They're a great band. So again, it's what you like. So I would suggest Google. Two things: Google and Spotify. So Spotify is nice because you could look up smart hip hop or hip hop bands, and someone made a playlist already, and it's probably a decent playlist because it'll have a bunch of subscribers. So the thing you're looking for, woman positive hip hop, I'm sure it's a playlist. I guarantee you it's a playlist. I can almost guarantee it. Social justice oriented hip hop. And that's the one takeaway, I think, which you may ask, what's the big takeaway, is that the mission is to not just look at hip hop, rap as a monolith, just like we don't want to look at the communities from whence it comes as a monolith, or any community, or any culture, or any genre. It's not a monolith. Hip hop is, I think, by far the most diverse art form, or certainly musically. You're not going to hear the subject matter in rock and roll. You're not going to hear it in pop. You're not going to hear it in country. You're not going to hear any of the world's greatest, musical art forms. You're not going to hear the depth of substance that you hear in rap. It's impossible. It just doesn't happen. No one's singing all these songs. Biz Markie has a song called "Pickin' Boogers." Sorry, you're not going to hear, Garth Brooks doing there's nobody doing a song about picking boogers, But I mean, the scope of the human experience: love, death, hate, war, fear, depression, aspiration, imagination. Songs about going into other dimensions or other planets. There's so much. You won't hear that in any others. Not that depth. So while we may pick out the non-melodic examples or the misogynistic examples, that's unfair. That's not you. I'm not judging. I'm generally speaking. This is the mission, because our own hip hop fans, our own members of the community, they're jaded. They don't like the way the industry has taken it. They believe the same things. They're like, it's gone, it's dead, it's crap now. I listen to the radio, I can't stand what my children listen to. Well, our parents couldn't understand what we were listening to. I mean, that's just the way of the world. So the big takeaway is, and I speak about social justice because the upliftment of the communities from whence hip hop came is paramount in America right now, and throughout the world. Obviously, you have different iterations of this, but it's paramount. It was the summer of revolution in America. George Floyd protest. Everybody got up. All the people who had never even stood up before were like, this is enough. I can't stand this anymore. All the, liberals, white liberals came out of the woodwork and said, well, all right, now is enough. You guys were really serious about this police brutality thing, weren't you? Wow, I had no clue. And, okay, great. But for years, and I say it comes from our own, I criticized Questlove of The Roots back in Ferguson, because he went on his Instagram and said, where is the protest music? That concept that you go back to the 60s and you hear about, Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan and Marvin Gaye and Janis Joplin and, this surge, this popularity of protest music, which, again, front and center, on the radio, but certainly was part of the zeitgeist at the time. And Questlove was lamenting that, in just a few years ago, Ferguson, that this wasn't a thing in music and specifically in hip hop. Again, Public Enemy, KRS-One, you think of these powerhouses that did that. And I pushed back on that and I said, publicly, because I'm an advocate and I'm a loudmouth sometimes. And I said, that's horribly unfair to the thousands of artists that, number one, have been doing protest music. Tef Poe, who lived in the area, for example, but Rebel Diaz, Immortal Technique, the list goes on, who have been doing protest music for years before this flare-up and will be doing it for years to come. You're not mentioning them because they're not on the radio. It's a slap in the face to the idea that this isn't being done by those artist activists that I talked about, who may not be very popular or be on the radio, but they're literally leading voting drives, or they're literally locking arms, shouts to Hassan Salam and rest in peace, my friend Majesty in New York, that were at the bridge blocking in protesting Eric Gardner's death in Staten Island, New York, another police killing, and then doing an album release party at Webster Hall, very big venue in New York City when it was open. And instead of having, they had tables where you could buy their, T-shirts, but they also had tables set up from organizations like Cop Watch, which was a local-based organization that was, a grassroots organization, community organization that was against police brutality. And they had them there at an album release party with flyers and pamphlets and sign-up sheets, to get involved in that movement. Come on, Quest. Like, Questlove is saying that this doesn't exist. We need more of it. What do you need? Like I said, what do you need Kanye West to make a song about racism? Like, come on, stop it. Hip hop, this is the big takeaway. Hip hop has way more to offer humanity than songs on the radio.
Yes. Yes.
And the Questloves of the world, with platforms, I've always said, could help the cause a little bit by saying we need more protest artists, like, and then name the names I just named. That would do great this is, I'm not picking on Questlove. Again, some of our own, in my opinion, some of our own cultural ambassadors also are a bit jaded by the perceptions that you and I think a lot of other people far removed from hip hop have. And my job is to tell you otherwise.
You do it pretty darn well. Tell me what projects you have with the center going on right now.
Yeah, so one that I liked, and I was leading up to it, and I lost my point, but the social justice aspect of this, we have a podcast called Newsbeat, which is an award-winning it's a journalism podcast. It focuses on social justice issues in the United States, although some of them you could relate to if you live in other places. This podcast is very unique in that we interview activists and experts and authors and other journalists about these issues. We weave that under a bed of music. There's music throughout, sort of like a score, and so like a movie score. It actually sets the mood a lot, and so we do this very strategically and purposefully. And then at 3 points within the episode, each episode is about 20 minutes long, and at 3 points in the episode, that little conversation, think of it as 3 acts. And at the end of each act, we have invited brilliant independent hip hop artists to rap 16 bars, a verse essentially, about the issue that we're talking about.
Oh, wow.
In that episode.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And so they're the featured artist for the episode. So they will amplify, put an exclamation point on the subject and what we just heard the experts talking about, but in a very compelling artistic way. It's unlike anything else. We like to say it's like as if there's a program out here called Democracy Now! We like to say it's a Democracy Now! And Black Thought from the Roots had a podcast baby, because we get to put these two worlds of journalism and artistry together. It's kind of an acclaimed thing, but it's very niche, and so we enjoy doing it, and I think that it is a perfect example of what I was saying before, where hip hop can be used in ways that we don't think of. It's not on the radio. It's literally journalism, not pseudo journalism, not storytelling. Listen to the rappers on Newsbeat, and you'll see that we're using it as journalism, and we've been lauded for it, which is great. The other project that I have is Hip Hop Can Save America, which is the podcast I mentioned earlier, and it's an interview show just like this. I just talk to people, all the people that are doing the things that I talked about. I interview them, and that's how I learn about these things, and I have them speak for themselves. So we've had, I like to say it's the world's smartest hip hop podcast. I've had more PhDs on this hip hop podcast than probably any hip hop podcast. And again, it's teaching artists. It's people that are very much connected to the culture. I Mikhail Amin, who teaches young people. He's a mentor. He's gone into justice systems. He works at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. He's a cultural ambassador that's toured the world, speaking about hip hop and teaching about hip hop. So he's all of these things, but he also puts out records. He's an artist. So people like that, the leaders in the education field, Genesis B, who's we're on hiatus until March, but the current episode, Genesis B, who epitomizes that idea of community artist activism. She made a lot of noise in one of her concerts a couple years ago. She's from Mississippi, and in Mississippi, the state flag still has Confederate symbol on it in the middle of the state flag. Now, Confederate symbolism has been widely kind of, it's a big thing out here, and we've mostly removed it. But to be in a court of law, for example, and see the state flag hanging above you, and there's a Confederate symbol of, racism and all these terrible things, it needs. So there's been 100-year effort to change the state flag, and that's a very difficult thing to do in a place like Mississippi for this reason. Genesis B did a protest at a concert. Again, rapper. I've been covering her for 10 years, but at this one concert, she held a noose around her neck, draped in the Confederate flag, made a big protest about her state, Mississippi, because the governor had signed into a law like Confederate Heritage Month or something like that. And she said, "Look, this is enough is enough. We can't." Do this. This was her protest. She threw the flag in the crowd. I think they all ripped it up or whatever. It was a big thing. Billboard published it. All these places published it. It then pivoted her to then go on the road and with a community activism group, start being a poet laureate for a group that was trying to influence evangelists to vote their conscience rather than their party throughout the United States, throughout the last election thing. And in some ways, re-energized this campaign. They took a vote on it in November. State flag is being changed. Confederate symbolism removed. Now, she's not the one that did it, but she was part of that movement at the tail end of it.
Catalyst, yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So it's people like that I interview. And now, finally, when this happens, she gets, a bunch of press and, well-deserved press. But I usually get them first. Let's just say. So Hip Hop Can Save America, where we talk to those folks that are doing this work, and need to be recognized for it. And that's under the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy, which is a nonprofit. I'm attempting to, and I've been attempting for some time, to kind of institutionalize everything I'm talking about. A place where this kind of journalism lives, where this kind of advocacy lives, maybe a hub for information for folks to learn more about hip hop. And, there are other organizations that do this. There's some historical base, the history of hip hop, education. I'm trying to kind of be this hub because, again, I could find social justice, political, fine arts, health and wellness, and have it under one roof. So those are all those things. And I do a bunch of other side things, I have my own podcast production company. I'm a DJ and a public speaker. I go out and do these talks. And so, yeah, I do some things.
I can see you would be a very successful public speaker because you are fascinating to listen to.
Thank you.
What's the URL for the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy?
Yes, hiphopadvocacy.org. It's you can, and Hip Hop Can Save America is the podcast. You can go to hiphopcansaveamerica.com. It'll take you there. And yeah,
And Newsbeat is the other
US
podcast.
US Newsbeat.
Okay.
usnewsbeat.com. There's a BBC Newsbeat. That's not us. And me, mannyfaces.com. It actually is my hub, and all of these tributaries shoot off from there. So you could, if you remember nothing else, remember my crazy name and find me there.
Anything you'd like to say in conclusion as we wrap up?
No, again, I thank you deeply for bringing me on. I know what it goes into this sort of thing, so I respect the podcast game, and I appreciate that you opened up your earwaves. Is that a word? Your earwaves. I'm gonna patent that. I like that. And I encourage anyone listening who wants to find more. I'm very open and approachable. Please reach out, and I'm glad to go into this in more depth. If something about this interests you, the musicality aspect of it, specifically, I'll point you exactly where you need to go, and they'll break down that issue, a lot more definitively. So that's my goal. So if anyone, yourself included, feels like you want to know more, I am here for that. So.
I am so grateful. You have really opened my eyes and ears, and I will begin my study based on what you have told me about.
I was gonna say, in hip hop we have a saying, "Each one teach one." So I appreciate that. So, yeah,
You're doing great work, and I really admire
I appreciate the appreciation. Thank you so much.
it. My thanks to Manny Faces. You can find out more about him in the show notes. I invite everyone to tell me what you've always wanted to try. I'm Liz Sumner, reminding you to be bold, and thanks for listening.